You should also the screen. You can just click got it and that'll go off your screen. So thanks all for joining us tonight. As we are in the 3 weeks, and our focus no doubt turns to the destruction of the Batei Mikdash, and Bob has done a fair amount of extensive research on the second Beit, the period that followed the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. For those of you who just joined, I see a lot of you who just joined us, which is very nice. I am going to repost the link that Bob shared with the timeline that is relevant to the talk tonight. And without further ado, I turn it over to Bob Damast to share with us about the Jewish life following the destruction of Bayit Sheni.
Good evening. This evening is the first of 2 programs that will explore the often ignored history of Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. A housekeeping note, there is an annotated timeline that I prepared. I don't know if you can see this. Has a lot of information there. It covers the earlier period and leading up through the Muslim conquest. You can download it from the shul's website. Mipnei Chata'enu Galinu Me'artzenu, a prayer that we say in the Musaf of the Shalosh Regalim. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. I think most of us understood this to mean that following the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people were exiled from Israel. That is certainly the historical view that was adopted by the famous 19th and early 20th century Jewish historians Heinrich Graetz and Simon Dubno. However, this perspective on the exile and the history of the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael is factually wrong, and hence the topic of our discussion during the next 2 weeks. We will examine the destructiveness of the 2 major revolts, as well as what day-to-day life was like in Israel during the 600 period of Roman Byzantine rule. And we will look at the development of Jewish religious and communal institutions that help structure their lives, as well as Jewish life in the diaspora. I would like to start with a look at Jewish life on the eve of destruction. The diaspora was already hundreds of years old at the time of the revolt. In fact, there were likely more Jews living outside of Israel than in Judea. Professor Sailor Baron of Columbia University conjectured that the world Jewish population at this time was as much as 8 million people, with 1 million living in Bavel and 2.5 million people living in Judea. It is estimated that Jews comprised 10 to 15% of the population of every city or town of any size on the Mediterranean littoral, and that 1 million Jews lived in Egypt. A significant factor assisting the growth of the diaspora throughout the Roman Empire can be found in Roman law. Romans were very careful to recognize and give protection to the ancestral customs of the various conquered peoples in their provinces, and thus allowed the practice of foreign religions. This provided the legal basis under Roman law for the practice of Judaism and for the various privileges awarded to Jewish communities to observe the Shabbat and festivals without civil liability, to observe kashrut, and to send money to the temple in Jerusalem. Various edicts extended physical protection of the Roman state to synagogues and to sacred texts, and to compel local cities to observe these privileges. These privileges extended into the Byzantine period until Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire and anti-Jewish edicts were enacted, an issue we will discuss next week. Although diaspora Jewry may have outnumbered the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, Israel remained the center of the Jewish world and the temple its heart. However far removed geographically from Judea, the diaspora Jewish communities scrupulously collected the annual temple tax, made pilgrimages, and otherwise seemed to have stayed in close communication with Judea. I think at this point it is important to mention the incredible debt that we owe to Josephus Flavius in our understanding of historical events that took place in the period prior to the destruction, and to his detailed eyewitness account of the revolt. Josephus's writings are unique because history is typically written by the winners, and history is most often the story of kings, generals, and not of a people. The revolt is barely touched upon by Roman historians of the period, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Frontinus. Tacitus, perhaps the greatest of the Roman historians, was a rabid anti-Semite who wrote the most appalling presentation of the tenets of Judaism and of the character of Jews in general. Tacitus's opus, Histories, however, only survives in parts, and missing from his history is the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the end of the rebellion. But for Josephus, we would know little more about the revolt than what we could learn from the Arch of Titus and from the Talmud, which was principally concerned with Musar and not with historical details or accuracy. The Talmud condenses teaching us about Senat Chinam to the allegory of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. In contrast, Josephus provides us with 2 entire chapters describing the horrors of the fighting between the various zealot factions in Jerusalem and the wholesale slaughter of Jewish leaders who did not support the revolt. Think Rabbi Yophanan ben Zakkai. Josephus provides us with an intense day-to-day diary of the rebellion and the destruction of Jerusalem. There is no comparable chronicle of war until modern times, and none by a historian with a more bird's-eye view of history. Returning to our topic. We tend to think of Judea at the time of the revolt in 70 as having a homogeneous Jewish population, and we tend to think of its borders as approximating biblical Israel. Both are misconceptions. Judea prior to the Hashmoneans was essentially a quiet, small inland Jewish island. During the rule of the Hashmoneans, neighboring provinces were conquered, thereby greatly extending Judea's borders and the ethnic mix of the population. Shimon, brother of Yehuda HaMaccabee, and Jonathan ruled as Kohen Gadol from 142 to 134 BCE and captured Jaffa, thus giving Judea access to the sea. Shimon was succeeded by his son John Hyrcanus as the Kohen Gadol, who also took the title of king. Hyrcanus ruled from 134 to 104 BCE and occupied the Galil, part of the Mediterranean coast, both north and south of Jaffa. And in 125, he conquered Idumea, where he forcibly converted that population, including the grandfather of King Herod. A year after his death, Hyrcanus was followed by Alexander Yanai as Kohen Gadol and as king, who solidified the Hashmonean expansion to include Gaza, territories in the north as far up as Banyas, Samaria with its large non-Jewish population, and most of the Jordan River Rift on both sides of the river, extending almost to Philadelphia, present-day Amman. These conquests were accomplished with great brutality, earning the hatred of native pagan populations, an ongoing hatred which would later contribute to the tensions leading up to the revolt, especially in Caesarea, which had a mixed Jewish and pagan Greek population. Perhaps the greatest of Herod's many building projects was his rebuilding of the Second Temple. Josephus gives us a detailed description of the wonders of the structure, and the Mishnah in Masechet Midot gives us careful physical measurements of the compound. What remains of the temple complex today is the huge platform on which Muslim shrines have been built and the retaining walls for the temple plaza. There are no archaeological remains of the temple itself, nor of the tremendous basilica that spanned the entire width of the southern end of the platform. However, the underground passageways that brought worshippers from the Hulda gates along the southern wall to the plaza remain largely intact, but unavailable even to Gentile scholars. Since 1948, Muslim authorities have barred any access, perhaps fearing the obvious. The passageways evidence the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount, which the Arabs claim now doesn't exist. Photos of the passageways from earlier periods do exist, and they reveal the intricate stone carvings on the ceiling. No detail was too small or overlooked by Herod in the temple's reconstruction, leading the Talmud to extol in Masechet Sukkah and Bava Batra the great beauty of the Beit HaMikdash that was rebuilt by Herod. In discussing the Beit HaMikdash, it is important to touch upon the existence of synagogues in Judea. First and foremost, Judaism, as long as the temple existed, was a religion based upon sacrifices, which could only be brought in the temple in Jerusalem. That being the case, what role did synagogues serve? The synagogue as an institution arose during the Second Temple period as a place for the weekly reading of the Torah, as a place of learning and as a communal institution. It may also have been a place for prayer, but that does not appear to have been the primary purpose. As the word synagogue suggests, it is a Greek word meaning a place of assembly, or Beit Knesset. Significantly, the existence of synagogues did not detract from the centrality of the Beit HaMikdash. The temple, aside from it being the sole venue for sacrificial worship, was perhaps more importantly the dwelling place of the Shekhinah. But above all, it represented the heart of the Jewish people and the greatest symbol of Jewish pride. It is hard for us to comprehend just how important the Beit HaMikdash was. This was not just a place to worship Hashem. There was a deep and fundamental belief that this was where Hashem's presence actually was located. Mishnah Masechet Midot notes that mourners who entered the temple precinct were greeted as follows: Hashochen b'bayit hazeh yenachemcha. He who dwells in this house will give you consolation. Hashem was clearly perceived as being present, a very tangible presence for the Jewish people. The belief that the Beit HaMikdash was Hashem's abode helps to explain the ferocious defense of the temple by the rebels in the days leading up to its destruction. Significantly, even after its destruction, the Beit HaMikdash remained a central force in molding the development of Rabbinic Judaism. By the middle of the first century, a strong diaspora numbering in the millions enjoyed prosperity and the right to practice their religion. At the same time, there was a growing tension and conflict between the Jewish communities and Greek pagan communities in an area stretching from Syria in the north, around the Mediterranean littoral to Cyrenaica, present-day Liberia in North Africa. The extent of violence between the Greek and Jewish communities in this period and the frequency of clashes began to escalate, as exemplified by violent anti-Jewish riots in Alexandria, which took place in the years 37, 40, 55, and 66. All this was but a prelude to the first revolt. The revolt was sparked in the city of Caesarea, the provincial capital of Judea. The population of Caesarea was composed of Jews, but with a Greek majority. In the year 66, Gentiles desecrated the synagogue in Caesarea, and the Roman garrison refused to intervene. Elazar ben Hananiah, the Kohen who administered the temple in Jerusalem, responded by directing the temple priests to stop accepting daily sacrifices in honor of Emperor Nero, and then ordered a successful attack on the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, all of whom were massacred. In retaliation for this massacre, the Greeks in Caesarea murdered the entire Jewish population of the city, estimated by Josephus to be 20,000 people. In early 67, Emperor Nero sent Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, at the head of the 12th Legion to suppress the revolt in Judea. The Roman forces were defeated at Beit Horon, and the few Roman survivors fled to Syria. When news reached Damascus of the near total destruction of the Roman forces, many of them being Syrian auxiliary troops, the city rose up against its Jewish inhabitants. According to Josephus, as many as 20,000 Jews were killed in Damascus, and the balance of the community was rounded up in captivity. Josephus reports that what followed the onset of the revolt in Judea were reprisal attacks on Jewish communities throughout not only Syria, but in all the provinces surrounding Judea. Following the defeat of Cestius Gallus and his legions, Nero appointed Vespasian, his most successful general, to suppress the revolt and sent him to Syria at the head of 2 Roman legions. Vespasian joined with his son Titus, who brought with him 1 Roman legion from Egypt, and began a methodical advance against all Jewish strongholds in the Galilee and Golan. Those cities that resisted, such as Gamla and the Golan, were destroyed. Those that surrendered were spared. By the end of the year 68, Judea, outside of the region surrounding Jerusalem, was pacified. The year 69 is known in Roman history as the year of the 4 emperors. Following the suicide of Emperor Nero, civil war broke out and a succession of Roman generals claimed the throne. The victor, Vespasian, was declared emperor by his troops in Israel on July 1, 69, and was later confirmed by the Senate in Rome on December 20, 69, and he then ruled as emperor for 10 years until his death in the year 79. Following Vespasian's departure for Rome, he left his legions under the command of his son Titus with the direction to capture Jerusalem. Vespasian also ordered Tiberius Alexander, the apostate nephew of Philo, and then governor of Egypt, to bring his legions to assist Titus in the siege. The siege of Jerusalem began during Pesach in the year 70, leading to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the month of Av, with fierce fighting continuing afterwards for a full month into Elul. Josephus records that by the 8th of Elul, Roman soldiers had grown tired of slaughtering the population, and Titus ordered that the survivors were to be taken captive and were herded to the temple plaza. There, over a period of days, they were selected. The most handsome were taken to Rome to march in a triumphal procession, and the balance was sold into slavery. Josephus reports that great numbers were presented by Titus to the provinces to perish in the arenas by sword or by wild beast. During the days that Jewish captives were kept prisoner on the Temple Mount, Josephus reported that 11,000 died of hunger and thirst. Josephus claims that 97,000 Jews were taken captive and that 1,100,000 died during the siege and subsequent bloodbath. To this number must be added 106,000 Jews killed in earlier fighting in the Galilee and Judea, as well as 37,500 Jews estimated by Josephus to have been killed by mob attacks in Caesarea, Beisan, Ashkelon, and Akka. Also, we must add to those taken captive an additional 41,000 Jews who were enslaved during the first 2 years of the revolt. These numbers are clearly vastly inflated. And contemporary historians estimate only 650,000 of the number of casualties of the siege, but only 650,000 represents a staggering loss of life. As those taken captive, it is believed that a large number were redeemed from slavery by other Jews, either locally or in the Roman provinces where they were sent. Having destroyed the Beit HaMikdash and quashed the revolt, Vespasian then abolished the Great Sanhedrin. The Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael were deemed a conquered people. Thus, they were no longer an ethnos entitled to communal rights or institutions under Roman law. It is understandable why historians like Gretz and Dubno seem to regard Israel as denuded of population, given the catastrophic loss of life that was suffered, and then look to the diaspora as a place of refuge. Gretz's reading of Josephus' The Jewish War left him to comment that the revolt left Judea almost completely desolate. Evidence that they were wrong as to the impact of the revolt can be seen from the regenerative power of the Jewish people, the gradual restoration of the economy and of Jewish institutions, and the growth of the population during the next 60 years preceding the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to 135. What is certain is that the areas in Judea, in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and those cities such as Yotpata, which resisted Rome, were reduced to rubble. Not only was the infrastructure of Israel severely damaged, but its agricultural productivity was sharply curtailed given the physical damage to fields and especially to fruit trees, but further exacerbated by the loss of manpower to work those fields and replant groves. Significantly, Vespasian declared all the lands within Judea proper as property of the Roman state and granted small farms to 800 Roman veterans who were settled in the area of Moza. The balance of the lands were either sold or leased out in large parcels to Romans of influence who then sublet individual farms, often to the prior Jewish owners whose status had shifted from owners to tenant farmers. It should be noted that some of these large tracts were also sold to wealthy Jews who had not participated in the revolt. Following the revolt, a fundamental change took place in the manner of how Judea was governed. Judea was then governed as a province by a senatorial rank governor with a full-time occupational army, the 10th Legion, which was stationed throughout the province at the expense of the provinces and headquartered on the Temple Mount. At this point, we need to step back to the last year of the revolt and to perhaps the true hero to emerge from the rebellion, Rabbi Yophanan ben Zakkai. The Tava in Masechet Gitin and in other sources tells the famous story of Rabbi Yophanan, who had his students carry him out in a coffin to escape the siege of Yerushalayim. When they reached the Roman lines, Yochanan ben Zakkai presented himself to Vespasian and hailed him as emperor. Vespasian's response to being hailed as emperor, an act of treason, was to condemn Yochanan ben Zakkai to death. In a sublimely deus machina theatrical moment, the Talmud tells us, at this point a messenger came to him from Rome, saying, "Up, Caesar is dead, and the notables of Rome have elected you as head." Vespasian then rewards Yochanan ben Zakkai by granting him permission to found a rabbinic academy in Yavne, and thus the Jewish people and the Pharisaic rabbinic tradition survived. Well, there are serious problems with the Talmudic account. One, Vespasian never laid siege to Yerushalayim. Two, Vespasian was declared emperor by his own troops on July 169. And three, at the time of the Roman siege in April 70, Vespasian was already emperor and was in Rome. However, it is possible to easily reconcile the Talmudic story of Yochanan ben Zakkai with historical facts. The siege that the Talmud speaks of can be seen not as the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70, rather it being the internal siege and reign of terror of the Zealots, the Canaim, within Yerushalayim in the year prior to the Roman siege, when Vespasian was still in Israel, a siege which refused to allow moderate Jewish leaders to escape Jerusalem. Wherever the truth may lie, Rabbi Yophanan ben Zakkai did settle in Yavne with his students. One can only imagine the despondency felt by the survivors of the revolt in Judea, and one can only imagine the near impossible struggle that awaited Rabbi Yophanan ben Zakkai, who took up the task of reuniting the people and establishing institutions to permit the reemergence of national and religious spirit that enabled the Jewish people and Judaism to survive and move forward in the wake of the temple's destruction. Rabbi Yochanan devoted himself to convincing the Jewish people that the absence of the temple did not mean an end to the Jewish people, and that it did not deprive the Jewish people of the power of atonement, which could be achieved through prayer. The principal institutions created by Rabbi Yochanan were the Beit Din, a high court, and a Beit Midrash, an academy. Both of these institutions were set up in Yavne, a small coastal city due west of Yerushalayim, located about halfway between Bnei Brak and Ashdod. Yavne, in the immediate years following the Korban, served as the de facto spiritual and religious capital of Israel. Gedalia Alon, an Israeli scholar, in his seminal work, The Jews in the Land of Israel in the Talmudic Age, raises several questions. Why Yavne? Was the Beit Din established in Yavne by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai done so with the permission of the Romans, thus giving it quasi-judicial status? Was the leadership of Rabbi Yochanan recognized by the majority of the people? And what were the achievements of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne? What do we know about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Various sources describe Rabbi Yochanan as a disciple of Hillel, but given that Hillel died in the year 9, this is unlikely and is a subject of dispute. But if Rabbi Yochanan was not an actual disciple, he was certainly a spiritual disciple, preaching love of humanity, peace, and a great empathy for the common man as seen by his halachic opinions. Rabbi Yochanan was very active before the destruction, was renowned in the Mishnah and Talmud for his scholarship, and his academy in Jerusalem had a broad public influence. One of his most famous rulings pertained to the suspension of the law of Eglah Arufah in the Civil War period immediately preceding the destruction. The Eglah Arufah was a sacrifice required to be brought when a body is discovered between two towns. In suspending the obligation to bring a korban, Rabbi Yophanan noted that the proliferation of murders placed an undue financial hardship on communities. We may only infer from his escape from Yerushalayim and from the liberties granted to him by Vespasian that he was not a zealot. He was also a realist, as we see from the saying attributed to him, if you have a seedling in hand or at the point of planting it, and someone tells you that the Mashiach has arrived, finish your planting first. The facts surrounding Rabbi Yochanan's selection of Yavne as a city of refuge are unclear. There are several Jewish sources that mention Rabbi Yochanan's encounter with Vespasian, as we discussed earlier, but only the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Gittin mentions Yavne. The other sources are silent in that regard. Historical records reflect that Yavne was not at that time a Jewish population center, and there is no evidence of any existing Jewish institutions in that city. Professor Alon posits that Rabbi Yochanan did not select Yavne, rather that Vespasian selected this already pacified city as a place where he could keep Rabbi Yophanan and his disciples under surveillance. The Jewish communal institutions that were to emerge in Yavne did so only after the war and gradually evolved because of the growth and stature of Rabbi Yophanan's academy. The Romans looked on tolerantly as the academy grew in significance and established a Beit Din, which was specifically not referenced to as the Sanhedrin, since Vespasian had abolished it. When Rabbi Yochanan and his Beit Din took on the authority to assume functions that were formerly a role of the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, the Romans, however, did not intervene. There is no mention in our sources of any political legal status for the Beit Din during the days of Rabbi Yochanan's leadership. The greatness of Rabbi Yochanan was that he stepped into the breach and assumed a leadership role and set the stage in later years for the emergence of the Nesiut and of a new Sanhedrin to govern Eretz Israel. Going to our next question, how was Yochanan ben Zakkai viewed by the people? The mere fact that he was given the honorific title of Rabban evidences that he was regarded by many as the spiritual leader of the community. More importantly, there are various takanot attributed to Rabbi Yochanan, such as fixing the date of Rosh Hashanah, that would not have been given effect if Rabbi Yochanan did not have broad popular acceptance. That is not to say that Rabbi Yochanan's leadership was universally accepted. There is no evidence that leading Kohanim, such as Rabbi Tzadok or his son Rabbi Elazar, recognized his supremacy. Perhaps this reflected the difficulty of the Kohanic class reconciling the sudden loss of status in the absence of the temple. Also absent from Yavne in Rabbi Yochanan's time were scholars who set up their own schools, such as Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Harkinus in Lud, Rabbi Akiva in Bnei Brak, Rabbi Chalafta and Tzipori, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanani in Pekin, and others, possibly reflecting their opposition to Rabbi Yochanan's political accommodation with the Romans. Nonetheless, most of these scholars do show up in Yavne, following the assumption by Rabban Gamliel of leadership of the academy and Beit Din around the year 85. Another question is why Rav Yochanan and not Rabban Gamliel? After all, Gamliel was the more distinguished and the heir of Hillel and Rabban Gamliel Hanasi. The likely answer may be seen in references of Masechet Gitin and Masechet Ta'anit that in the immediate aftermath of the revolt, Gamliel was kept from leadership by the Romans and did not step forward until approximately 15 years after the revolt, when it was safe to do so, at which point Rabban Gamliel claimed the right and assumed leadership in Yavne. The last question posed by Professor Alon relates to the achievements of Rabbi Yochanan. The greatest was the founding of the academy at Yavne, along with constituting a Beit Din that assumed some of the functions of the abolished Sanhedrin. This was a historic breakthrough that provided the foundation upon which to grow these institutions, which would have become the central leadership of the Jewish people for the next 400 years, not only in Israel, but in the diaspora as well. At a moment in time when the Jewish people were racked with despair, Rabbi Yochanan resuscitated the study of Torah and provided guidance to navigate a world without the temple. Following the destruction, there were a series of takanot issued, first by Rabbi Yophanan and later by Rabban Gamliel, that transferred some of the observances that were unique to the temple service outside the temple to the community, such as performing the mitzvah of lulav on all 7 days of Sukkot as a reminder of the temple service. Another minhag attributed to a baraita of Rabbi Yochanan and associated with the remembrance of the temple required Kohanim to remove their shoes before duching it. Rabbi Yochanan and later Rabban Gamliel strove to keep as many aspects of the temple service alive as possible in order to keep the memory of the temple and its hope for restoration alive. However, there were temple observances which had to be abolished. Two takanot which were ascribed to Rabbi Yochanan were suspending the obligation of bringing forth your fruits to Jerusalem and suspending the requirement that a convert not only circumcise and immerse in the mikveh, but that he bring a sacrifice to the temple, which was no longer possible. The period when Rabban Gamliel provided leadership in Yavne from the mid-80s to approximately 115 was the period when the Jewish community was reconstructed. During this period, the political and juridical structure of the community was restored, and this was ultimately to be recognized by Rome as representative of the Jewish people. Yavne became the seat of final decisions on all matters of halakha. It was a period that saw the ties with the diaspora renewed and strengthened, and the export of takanot affecting Jewish ritual life being transmitted abroad. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. This period saw the rise of centers of Jewish learning throughout Eretz Israel, as well as early drafting of parts of the Mishnah, specifically Masechet Midot, Tamid, Yoma, and Eduyot. It was also at this time that some of the essential elements of the liturgy were edited. Perhaps most significant to Jewish life was a restoration during this period of judicial autonomy and a de facto but not de jure recognition by the Roman authorities of Rabban Gamliel as the head of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, as seen by the revival of Jewish courts of law that had been abolished by the Flavian emperors. The land of Israel after the revolt was really two areas, Jewish Israel and a periphery of Greco-Roman towns in Samaria, along the coast, and in the Jordan Valley. The Greco-Roman towns were recognized by the Roman authorities as self-governing. The non-Jewish inhabitants were primarily Aramaic-speaking, although Hellenistic in culture, with theaters, stadia, wrestling, and boxing matches. The language of civil administration, however, was Greek, as was the language of culture and of international trade. Thus, it was necessary for Jews to have some working knowledge of Greek. The Talmud in Masechet Sota notes that Rabban Gamliel had 500 students trained in Greek to enable his court to communicate effectively with the Roman administration. The relations between Jews and Gentiles could best be described as antagonistic. Keep in mind Caesarea and other cities during the revolt. Notwithstanding the mutual antipathy, during periods of peace and stability, there was mutual trade and cooperation. However, the pervasive character of pagan rites to be found in every sector of society, both social and economic, served to inhibit Jews from more fully participating in civil society. In fact, the Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah banned doing any business with Gentiles during their religious festivals, which often were timed to coincide with regional trade fairs. Of course, because of dietary restrictions, Jews could not socialize over meals with Gentiles. Even then, this was a way of doing business as it is now. The other major community in Israel throughout the 600-year period of our discussion were the Samaritans. A remnant of this community under the leadership of their Kohen Gadol still lives in Israel outside of Shechem by Har Gerizim. I had the opportunity a few years ago to visit with the brother of the Kohen Gadol and to visit their museum there. It's quite interesting. If you get the opportunity, it's something you might enjoy doing. The Samaritans were, during our period of discussion, the second largest population group and were for the most part viewed by the Romans and later the Christians and later by successive Muslim rulers as a distinct religion. Interestingly, early Tanaim viewed them as basically Jewish, with certain reservations. The Mishnah in Masechet Gittin presents a case where a get was submitted to Rabban Gamliel bearing the signatures of two Samaritan witnesses. He pronounced the get valid. However, a century later, Yehuda HaNasi ruled that Samaritans were Gentiles. Later, his son Rabban Gamliel held that meat slaughtered by Samaritans was not kosher. Perhaps the signature development during the inter-revolt period was the gradual de facto recognition by Rome of the Jewish people in Eretz Israel as an ethnos. This is a re-recognition as a distinct social and national group. What might seem obvious was not. After the revolt, the Jewish people in Israel were considered a conquered people with no communal rights and no rights to their own institutions. Following the end of Flavian rule, Rome, particularly under Emperor Trajan, took a more relaxed position, a factor which allowed Rabban Gamliel to assume his leadership position in Yavne and to allow the Jewish people to begin to administer their own internal affairs. The Beit Din in Yavne was slowly given the recognition by the Jewish people and by Roman authorities as a de facto Sanhedrin, and the office of Nasi was to be ultimately recognized as the Patriarchate, these becoming the principal institutions of Jewish autonomy. What was the extent of judicial power that the Beit Din and later the reconstituted Sanhedrin were able to exercise? The Sanhedrin was not able to exercise jurisdiction over Dinei Nefashot, or cases involving capital punishment. Although prior to the revolt, there was a question as to whether the great Sanhedrin had such power. For example, the trial of Jesus. After the revolt, this jurisdiction did not exist and was solely in the hands of the Roman administrators. Although there was a difference of opinion in the Mishnah as to whether Jewish courts could administer corporal punishment, the majority of the sages held that punishment by flagellation was an available remedy, as discussed in Mishnah Makot. Jewish courts under Rabban Gamliel and later were able to address the full scope of civil law issues. Of note is that Jewish courts did not have exclusive jurisdiction. Roman judges were available. Surprisingly, they even administered Jewish law. The Mishnah in Masechet Gittin notes that while Rabbi Tarfon taught that Jews should avoid Roman courts, even if their judgments correspond to Jewish law, it then noted, a get given under compulsion is valid if ordered by a Jewish court, but if by a Gentile court, it is invalid. However, if what the Gentiles do is beat the man and say, do what the Jews tell you, then it is valid. It would appear that Rabban Gamliel exercised the authority to ordain rabbis and to appoint local dayanim. This power may be seen as a fundamental aspect of Jewish autonomy and of the beginning of the centralization of power in the hands of the Nasi that was to evolve into the Patriarchate as an institution. The Beit Din of Rabban Gamliel and Yavne function as the final arbiter of questions of halachic interpretation. Tosfot report various instances when ritual decisions were referred to Yavne or were actually overruled by the Beit Din in Yavne. Ritual questions were also sent to Rabban Gamliel from the diaspora concerning observance of Shabbat and the Chagim. Rabban Gamliel made it his practice to visit towns throughout Israel where there was a Jewish population of any size to answer any halachic questions that might have arisen, as well as to cement their allegiance to the central authority of Yavne. Rabban Gamliel was also reported to have visited the Jewish community in Rome and to have sent shlichim to Alexandria to answer halachic questions. The Mishnah reports that Rabbi Akiva, while Rabban Gamliel was Nasi, traveled to Nahardiyah in Bavel, where he rendered halachic decisions as part of the effort to reestablish the bonds between Eretz Yisrael and the scattered Jewish communities of the diaspora. Another aspect of contact with the diaspora was financial support sent to Rabban Gamliel and then later to the later patriarchs from the diaspora in the form of a voluntary tax. Rabban Gamliel is credited with having established this format for support, which then lasted for generations and kept the Jews of the diaspora involved in maintaining the central institutions of the Jewish people established in Yavne. The destruction of the temple not only removed the sacrificial system, but removed the priestly and Levitical offerings, as well as the prescribed manner of celebrating the festivals. Logically, Rabbi Yophanan and Rabban Gamliel and the Academy of Sages in Yavne should have declared all of these aspects of Jewish law to be obsolete. However, to do so would have meant the immediate recognition that the loss of the temple was permanent. But the Rebbeim did the opposite. They taught the people to have the faith that the destruction of the temple was temporary and that the temple would be speedily rebuilt. Our tradition of counting the Omer that was instituted by the Rebbeim of Yavne memorializes a part of the temple service that can no longer be brought, a seasonal reminder to us that the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash should never be far from our minds. Jewish society, both before and after the destruction, was agrarian, with the overwhelming majority of its members living in towns and villages varying in size to as many as 5,000 people. However, there were several urban centers. Caesarea was the principal port, was the economic heart of Judea, and although its Jewish population had been wiped out at the start of the revolt, Jews did return to live there almost immediately after the revolt, and Tanaic sources mention a considerable population in later periods. Amoraic literature mentions a large community with an important Beit Din. Of interest is that the Talmud Yerushalmi notes that by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the population was Jewish, Samaritan, and Gentile, and that none of them represented a majority of the population. Akko was the second port city and had a thriving fishing industry. Josephus reports that the Jewish population of Akko had been wiped out during the revolt. However, the Jewish population returned soon afterwards, as there are reports of several visits to that community by Rabban Gamliel. This community over the years grew substantially until the Arab conquest in the 7th century. As an aside, or a side note of the resilience of Jewish communities in Israel, when Rambam visited Israel in the year 1165, he stayed in Acre, then a Crusader city, finding an established Jewish community there. When Binyamin Mitudela visited Acre 5 years later, he reported finding 200 Jewish families, 3 rabbis, and a Beit Din. The Jewish population of Acre swelled in the next century with the arrival from France of 300 rabbis and their families and the establishment of a large yeshiva. A further note is that Nachmanides moved to Acre, where he died in 1270. The city of Beit Sham is located in the Jordan Valley south of the Kinneret and was an agricultural center discussed in both the Mishnah and Talmud. Josephus reports that during the revolt, the Gentile inhabitants slaughtered some 13,000 Jews, but that did not stop Jews from resettling there after the destruction, as reported in both the Talmud Yerushalmi and Bavli, and as evidenced by archaeological ruins. Jaffa was a major port city. Before the revolt, it had a predominantly Jewish population. However, the city was leveled by Vespasian during the revolt and was later rebuilt by him as a Roman city. Flavia, which is Vespasian's family name, Iopa, Flavia Iopa. The historical record reveals that Jews returned to Jaffa before the Mishnah was redacted, and archaeologists have excavated a Jewish cemetery there dating from the 3rd century. Tiberias was built by Herod's son, Herod Antipas, naming it after the then emperor Tiberius. Around 17, it was made capital of the Galil. During the revolt, the elite Jews sided with the Romans, but the majority joined the rebels. When Vespasian took the city, he did not destroy it, but he did pull down its walls. After the revolt, the city remained primarily Jewish and had notable fishing and glass industries, and was the seat of the Sanhedrin during the period when the Talmud Yerushalmi was written. Tzipori had been the capital of the Galil with a primarily Jewish population. The city did not join in the revolt and retained a majority Jewish population throughout our period of study. In the period following the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Tzipori gained in importance as a religious center, was also a seat of the Sanhedrin for a time during the Mishnaic period, and was where the Mishnah was redacted by Yehuda HaNasi in the 3rd century. The city was razed by the Romans in the 4th century during the Gallus revolt, but was later rebuilt. That's it. Next week's program will examine the Bar Kokhba rebellion, efforts to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash during our period of discussion, the emergence of the Galil and Golan as primary centers of Jewish life, the rise of Christianity as a state religion and its impact on the Jewish community in Israel, and lastly, Jewish rebellions in 351 and in support of the Persian invasion in the 7th century. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob. You're getting a silent applause. You can't hear it because of the mute button. If anyone wants to jump in with a question now, you got a thumbs up from Steve Keller there on the emoji. Anyone want to jump in with questions for Bob before we close things out for tonight? Again, we'll meet again next week, but questions in the interim before we sign off?
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for coming, for finding the site.
Okay, yeah, nice turnout tonight. Thank you all for joining. And
Thank you, Bob.
we'll see everybody again next week. And
Hopefully.
Thank you so much, Bob, for a thorough presentation and a clear picture of Jewish life at that time period.